Hello guys, Bill here, SixRounds Studio. In today's video, I need to start the patch or the repair on the Mossberg 185 bolt action shotgun. From the last video, you know that this thing was split from here all the way to here, and we need to start that glue up before we do any of the rest of the work. But because I have to split this in order to get enough gap up here in the forearm, I'm not going to be able to glue up the whole thing. So what I want to do to start with is I want to get some glue down inside that smaller crack in the forearm. Once I've got that secured, then I can come back. Hello lights again. Yeah, we've got a really bad windstorm going on out here right now, and I think the power might go out anyway. So once we've got this glued up, then I can go back and start attacking this bigger gap that is the big one. And that's going to be a little bit more tricky to get this done. This smaller gap up front is not going to be too much of an issue. Now to do this, we're going to use several things. The first is we're going to use a 12-hour clear epoxy. That's a thinner epoxy, and we're going to be able to get that down, squeeze down inside that smaller gap. For the bigger gap, unfortunately, it is so large that I'm going to need to use some gap filling epoxy. So we're going to use this Acroglass from Brownells, not sponsored. So we're going to mix up that Acroglass, because not only is it a great epoxy, but it also has some fill characteristics because it is a heavier, thicker epoxy. So we'll be able to get that in there, and then from there, get this thing squeezed up. All right, so today we're going to use this 12-hour epoxy clear, and it's a two-part. It's a blend or a AB mix. So you've got the epoxy, and then you've got the filler, and then you've got the hardener. And this is done in equal parts. So we're going to mix that up. And one thing about any epoxies, you want to make sure you're mixing it thoroughly. Now the reason I like to use a 12 or a 24-hour epoxy is because it has longer open time, so you have more time to work with it, as opposed to 5-minute epoxy, which doesn't have the same strength in my opinion, and it dries so quickly that you can't get the repair done before things start to harden on you. So that's the first thing. We're going to get this stuff mixed up. And then we're going to add two components. The first is we're going to thin that epoxy down just a little bit, because I want to thin it enough so that it actually flows into what is a very small crack. So I'm going to have to force it in with a spatula. But in order to do that, I need to get it thinned enough. So all I'm going to do is literally add small drops. And again, the idea is hopefully to thin it just enough so that I can squeeze it. And you don't want to thin it too much. Just thin enough so that you can get it dropped in there. And in fact, denatured alcohol or acetone is a solvent for epoxy, or most epoxies. I'll use that to clean up after. If I have a repair that I'm not going to refinish. I am going to refinish this one, so I'm not going to worry so much about cleaning up the surface around it. Now the next thing I'm going to add, now this one may seem odd to you, I'm going to add a little bit of white pigment. Now, let me explain that one. When you use a clear epoxy, it actually leaves a dark seam where the line of the epoxy is. Now, you would think, oh, that's not a big deal. But what it is I do a lot of faux painting or a lot of faux finishing, trying to hide these repairs. It's much harder to hide a black line than it is to hide a white line, believe it or not. So when you paint over that line, you're painting over the white, so you can actually blend that out and make it disappear much quicker. Whereas with a white line or slightly white line, again, you're painting over the white. So I always like to add just a little bit of white when I'm doing these kind of repairs to the epoxy. So you'll end up, either that line, epoxy line, will completely disappear, or it'll have a white tint to it, which things like brown pigmented paint oils will cover over much easier. So maybe you can see that I've added that white pigment to that. So we've thinned it down and we've turned it white. So I've opened this thing up. I've used this wedge, this soft pine wedge that I use to split these things, and I'm trying not to break it. That's obviously not what I want to do. So what's going to happen is I'm simply going to force that down into that crack. Trying to use like a hydraulic pressure to push it down in. This is pretty thick, so the likelihood of getting it all the way through is probably going to be pretty small. But like I said, we'll keep hydraulicking it and trying to push it down in. And we're going to do the same thing here where the crack comes through. And just trying to hydraulic it down in or force it down in as far as it's willing to go, actually. Alright, I am going to clean that with a little bit of acetone on the inside because I'm not going to be able to get in there easily once this is done. Fortunately, this is the forearm, so the amount of stresses that are going to be placed on this by the recoil of the gun will be very, very small. Alright, I think we got about as much in there as we're going to get. So I did some experimenting earlier, and I tried to put a clamp on the crack, but what happened is the clamp actually put pressure in here and rolled it or squeezed it in and opened that crack up, and we don't want to do that. So in that experiment, what I discovered, and I am going to pull my wedge out, what I discovered, and you can see how that crack came together and squeezed out some epoxy. So what I discovered is that if there's a, boy, I did squeeze out on both. Good. So what I discovered in my experimenting is if I put 2 blocks of wood in, which fill up that dimension between here, if I fill that up, and then take another soft pine wedge and squeeze it in, that it actually closes that gap up even more and squeeze some more epoxy out. So if you remember from the last video on this, I was on this Mossberg. I was going in with acetone and cleaning the oils and crap out of the inside of those cracks so that we got a good bond with the epoxy. Alright, so with that said, what we're going to do is we're going to simply let this rest overnight. I need to have this really well attached before I try to split this again to get the fill epoxy in that back larger crack. So we're going to leave this overnight, and we'll come back tomorrow and do the rest of that repair. All right, everybody, it is the next day, and the epoxy on the forearm has hardened and dried, and now we're going to tackle the big gap in the back. And I've got it sort of lightly clamped in my vise because I want to make sure as I'm tugging on this that I'm not putting any potential stresses on that repair. I doubt it's going to come apart, but again, sometimes there's value in being a coward. So we're going to take the coward's approach and have that clamped in there just lightly so that when we pull on this, we're not going to put that stress over here. Now, I mentioned yesterday that we used a thin clear epoxy in the front, and we're going to use a heavier epoxy in that larger crack. And again, the Aquaglass, not sponsored, has the ability to do gap filling a little bit better. This is again 50-50 mix. So we are going to mix up a fairly large amount of the Aquaglass. So again, like most epoxies, it is a two-part, A and B, and we're going to mix these two together. So I am mixing up a little bit larger batch because, again, I want to make sure I've got enough for that entire gap fill. Mixing it thoroughly. We are going to have to open this crack quite a bit. So I am going to use a screwdriver to pry it open as much as I can. And I will flip this over here and get the bottom in a little bit as well. Now the crack in this case is wide enough that I can get stuff down in there a little bit easier than I could have that small one on yesterday's. Alright, let's roll this over. Now I mentioned yesterday that I was adding a white pigment because I wanted to be able to faux paint or hide that that line, and I'm not painting this white because I am thinking I'm going to wind up replacing a lot of wood here. I don't know quite how yet. Alright, I think that is as much as I'm going to get in there. I need to use two clamps. This is out of alignment this way, so not a lot, but before I squeeze it up here, I am going to put a small C-clamp in to help bring the level of these two halves in alignment with each other. But before I do that, I need to clean out that epoxy, because I don't want my C-clamp gluing itself to the inside of the wood. So we'll take out any of that excess epoxy on the interior. I am going to put a small piece of tape on the screw anvil, because I don't want the C-clamp to stick, and I would rather just leave the tape behind in this case. And as I said, It's simply trying to bring the two halves in alignment. Okay, just like that. Nice. And then, if everything goes well, we're going to try and squeeze these two halves together. And this, I am not completely warm and fuzzy about just yet. That's a nice match right there. So I have had controversy over the years, me using this red duct tape. I don't know why, but we are going to use some red duct tape because I need to squeeze this in just a little bit. So if you're one of those that hates my red duct tape, I'm sorry guys, I'm sorry. It just works. I'm sure any duct tape would work, but this one happens to be the one I have to make sure that we get the squeeze out of there. So let me try and give you a close-up of the gap filling properties of this Acra glass, so you get a better sense of why I'm using it. So unfortunately, when the break occurred, it actually chipped away a huge piece of wood. So I'm not entirely sure how I'm going to do this yet. I'm not sure if I'm going to just use the epoxy and faux paint over the epoxy. Or if I'm going to remove and replace material. We'll see how that goes once this thing hardens up and I get a sense of what it looks like. Now in the beginning I told you I had to clean out the gaps or the splits with acetone. And actually it was a good thing that I did, because I think what this thing was glued together with originally was rubber cement. Now I don't know what the guy or the person who repaired it thought that rubber cement was going to do, but anyway, I had to clean out all that rubber cement, so I had to keep going in after it with that acetone. The acetone actually softened the rubber cement enough that I could use dental picks and get in there and poke away at the parts of the wood structure that was left and pull out as much of that rubber cement as I could. I did that over 2 or 3 days, prepping it for this. I'm hoping I got enough of it out that epoxy is going to work, but again, I'm fairly confident, and we'll see how this works tomorrow when we pull this out. Tomorrow, I want to talk a little bit about using screws to secure this. And it's interesting because screws have become a topic on the repairs. I've had viewers tell me that because I don't screw this, that the epoxy is not going to be strong enough. And then recently I had another viewer who told me that using screws is the dumbest thing that they've ever seen, because the epoxies have the ability, or modern epoxies have the ability, to be often stronger than the original wood. And I do agree with that, mostly in theory. There are some benefits to adding screws in certain places. And if you were here on the job, you might get a better sense of how those screws help to make a more robust repair, as opposed to sitting behind your keyboard and commenting from hundreds of miles away. So anyway, to that end, I am going to let the true screw believers and the anti or no screw believers have it out together in the comment section. So here's the only rules to that. You have to be polite, you have to explain what your experience is, and then tell us what the engineering and the science is behind your opinion. And let the best opinion win. I don't think there will be one. So we are going to put a screw back in here, but in this case we're going to do it for a couple reasons. First off, yes, I do hope that that epoxy does what it's supposed to do. But second off, we also have a pretty large break, and somebody's already put a screw in this, so it's not going to matter whether I add another brass screw or stainless steel screw to take up the split that is in this piece of wood. Alright guys, I will see you tomorrow when we take all this apart and then look at that repair and see how well it came out. Next day, let's take all the tape and the clamps off and see what this repair looks like. Red tape for all my red tape haters. Clamp, clamp, and then the big clamp comes off. And sounds good. The epoxy is nice and hard. It feels good. The alignment is really pretty good. We may have to make a few small adjustments to it. I'm not sure how I'm going to fix this yet, so I'm going to have to fill this in somehow. I'm not entirely sure how I'm going to do that. I really don't want to use epoxy. I'd rather use a piece of wood to fill that in, but that would really test how I get through this. We'll think about this. We got a little time before we make that decision. Now, back to the screws. I have this stainless steel screw that I'd like to put in here. And it may or may not be a little bit too big. So what I want to do is at least pre-thread it. And this is the biggest screw I could get, because my problem was that I took this huge machine screw out, and the biggest screw I could get was a 14, but this is resisting me, so I'm thinking we are threading. I think we are threading. Okay. Alright, that is bottomed out. It is not coming through the other side yet, but I'm still a little bit proud on this, so I'm going to take that screw back out. See if I can give you a really good close-up of it. I am going to take it back out, and I want to countersink it just a little bit. If you remember, I told you I was going to slab off some material and put a walnut overlay or applique over the top of that. I've done this many times on other stocks. And I want to put that applique over it to hide the holes, because if I don't do that, the only thing I'm going to end up with is these circles, and the circles will show, because one of the tricks of doing finishing or repairs or faux is that the human eye picks up straight lines. So you give the human a straight line and it sees it. If you give kind of curved or swoopy lines, the human eye is less likely to pick it up. So that's one of the tricks. So I do want to counter this first. I could do this in the Bridgeport, But I think the setup is going to be more than this small little job is going to require. So we're just going to use a drill motor here. And I'm trying to match the taper on the bottom of this screw so that the entire taper fits flush against the wood. We may have to shorten the screw on the other end a little bit, but I'm not worried about that. As long as I've got some good threads already pre-made into the wood. Even if I cut off the tip a little bit, it will follow those threads. Ooh, that's going to work really good. Okay. Alright, I am going to put a small amount of clear epoxy around those threads so that once this is in there, it's going to add additional strength, but also keep that screw from possibly backing out. I doubt it ever would, but once this screw is buried underneath that applique, you're not going to be able to get access to it again. So I'm only going to mix up a very, very small amount of this. You anti-screwing guys, you must be really having heart palpitations right now. This has got to be eating you up in the worst way. Like I said, if you disagree, leave a comment. Tell me what your experience is. Share the science. I like it a lot, boys and girls. I like it a lot. Alright, so we're going to end this video right here. I need to let that dry a little bit as well. I also need to think about how I'm going to fix this. I've got several things that we need to tackle. I still have a little bit of a chip out of here. I need to figure out how I'm going to fix that radius. I still got to figure out how I'm going to repair this entire crack where the wood got chipped away and there's nothing there, so the epoxy does show. I think I've already shown that to you, but anyway, I got to fix that. I need to fix this little piece or this chip that's been taken out of the box mag. I have to do that. Everything else looks pretty good. I need to make these appliques because I have to hide the two circles, the two holes where the screws were put in the past. So I have to figure that out. I'm going to, and again, in one of the upcoming videos, I am going to slab that and put in some walnut appliques. And when all those repairs are done, I'm going to strip this, steam out the dents, and refinish it, and by the time we're done, it'll look like it was never broken. Alright guys, if you enjoyed this video, you know the score. Give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. We love you guys, we love you for being here, and I will see you in the next video coming up, where we're probably going to go back onto the Stevens favorite model 1915. That's coming along fine. That's been a lot of fun to work on that one. I will see you guys in the next video. Bye guys.